I grew up regularly listening to the Adventures in Odyssey radio program from Focus on the Family back when I was a kid. And since I became an adult, I've found myself going back to that childhood staple a number of times over the years for nostalgia's sake, and always being pretty intrigued by its fairly consistent output of concisely topical and highly intentional moral and reflective storytelling. So a couple weeks back, I had one of those nostalgia whims that I get every once in a while. And as I was getting into my car for my morning commute to work, I thought, why don't I head over to witsend.org and start up a good old audio adventure from the good old days. And when I went over there to their radio current episodes thing, one of the titles that was listed there as currently airing was one that brought back some immediate memories. It was called The Case of the Secret Room. Now, there have been a number of Odyssey episodes that included finding some kind of secret room or passage or tunnel in or under or around Whit's End. So I knew from the title that this was going to be one of those great, fun-loving, unforgettable episodes, but I didn't know which great, fun-loving romp it was going to be. So it turns out that particular episode, The Case of the Secret Room, is a two-part episode consisting of episode number 39 and episode number 40, which first aired in August 1988, 3 years before I was born. Of course, I obviously didn't hear it in 1988. But anyway, so this particular episode was the one where Whit and Tom Riley are moving some furniture, and they find a secret room inside Whit's End with a skeleton inside of someone who was shot back in the 1940s, whose name was Spencer Barfield. So in classic murder mystery style, Whit and friends begin to investigate, starting with looking through some microfilm at the library and to find out about the bank robbery that happened around that time, and then going over to the house of creepy old Percival Fenwick, who was bank manager back in the 40s, and then later on ending up talking with Barfield's sister and then some other people, until finally at the end, in shamelessly classic murder mystery style, of course, the true villains end up revealing themselves while pointing guns at Whit and the gang and ordering them to dig up the loot and hand it over. And so by the time the mystery has been resolved, the viewers' best guesses about who was good and who was bad, those thoughts have gotten flipped around on their head. And then in that final moment of tension at the end, some surprise good guys show up at the last minute and save the day. And the episode ends with our characters, particularly Whit, reflecting about the power of greed and the nature of sin and how much harm people end up doing just for the sake of something like money. As well as Whit reflecting near the end what it means that now there is within Whit's End a permanent reminder of the stain of sin in the form of this secret room that's now there and what it represents. Anyway, so that's the synopsis. And if you grew up with Odyssey like I did, you probably remember at least bits and pieces of the episode because it's one of those that kind of sticks in your head. But as I was listening to that episode a couple weeks ago in my car, I was so struck by the bits of subliminal and not so subliminal messaging contained in the episode that the moment I got my car parked, I just had to pull out my phone and start spitting out some jot notes. So I hastily jotted down this header: secret room, implicit messaging. And then I started putting down bullet points. And the first one was benefit of the doubt, holding back assumptions and assuming the best. Because ever since near the very beginning of the episode, Whit and friends had a lot of people that seemed suspicious. Most notably, creepy old Mr. Fenwick, whose house and everything in it were designed to make the listener feel afraid. So the creaking of the door, references to his collection of old African masks, etc. And he talks like this. What's it to you? You know? I've always loved collecting masks. You know? And then there's the police inspector who's acting suspicious, and he keeps trying to get Whit to stop investigating. And he's the one who secretly put that anonymous note on Whit's car, leave well enough alone. You know? So even though both Whit and the audience are highly suspicious of a number of these characters and have good reason to be, yet they still proceed with a really kind, respectful, benefit of the doubt kind of attitude, even while at the same time having to take pains to behave cautiously and to recognize potential danger. The next thing I put down was treating someone well who is different and gives you the creeps, not prejudging others. Because Mr. Fenwick in particular, he was presented as this isolative, grumpy, unlikable, and actually frightening person. Back when I was listening to this episode as a kid and they made reference to his collections of African masks, that just went totally over my head because I didn't know what an African mask looks like. But basically, overall, what they're trying to do here, his house and his personality and everything together, it's supposed to be this one collective haunted house stereotype picture in kind of a cardboard cutout kind of way. But Whit models treating such a person with kindness, respect, and courtesy, and no prejudgment. And this works all the better because he does have the cardboard cutout, kind of cartoony, creepy voice every time he talks and every time he demands they leave him, leave me alone. I don't want to see anybody, you know. So this part here, this isn't the episode's explicit messaging. This is the implicit messaging. So Chris at the end, when she gives the moral of the story, neither she nor anybody else tells you that this is the point of the show, because it's not the point. And probably the creators didn't even know they were doing it. But Whit is just acting like a Christian, and he's serving as a beautiful example to be imprinted into the minds of the listeners. Next, I put down managing suspicion in an open-handed, gracious, and respectful manner, which becomes more and more noticeable the more the show moves forward. As it goes forward, and it becomes more and more clear that Whit's graciousness is not due to lack of suspicion, but in fact, Whit and the other main characters have very strong and justified suspicions of many of the characters in the story. Then I put down respect for the law, in parentheses, Whit's comments about people shouldn't be vigilantes, but, etc. So this is an episode where for most of the runtime of the episode, it seems that the police officer is one of the primary villains, and it seems quite clear for much of the episode. Turns out to not quite be the case, but so Whit chooses to continue to investigate this issue, even though they were told not to. But that decision is approached with this attitude of respect rather than an attitude of rebellion. And Whit makes it specifically clear that he doesn't believe in being a vigilante. That's the word he uses. People shouldn't be a vigilante, but in this situation, you know. So he specifically clarifies he doesn't believe in being a vigilante, but that he's choosing to investigate this because the police aren't investigating it, and he feels that it would be irresponsible of him not to do so. And obviously he's not breaking any law or doing anything that could be construed as wrong. So this really is an attitude, and it's an attitude that really for a lot of us is a refreshing alternative to the really anti-authority obsessiveness that tends to pervade so much mainstream programming in television and film. The next thing I put down, humble apology of a powerful person, demonstrated by the inspector near the end, expressing his regret at not treating Whit with more trust or respect, comes out in the form of an apology and an extension of friendship. This is one of those moments that is really just kind of beautifully mundane. If you aren't paying attention, you'll miss it, or you might just roll your eyes because it's too cookie cutter or it's too unfamiliar to your experience. But I think really this is just one more stellar bit of modeling that primarily the listener is only going to pick up on a subliminal level. So this is the part where near the very end of the episode, the inspector comes up to Whit and apologizes for not giving him the kind of trust or respect that would have allowed him to play a more helpful role in the situation. Because if you remember, for the whole episode, the inspector's telling Whit, leave well enough alone, quit putting your nose in, all that kind of stuff. And so he apologizes near the end. Now, of course, realistically speaking, a typical police inspector would be highly unlikely to actually apologize to a shop owner in that particular kind of way after spending all that prior time trying to tell him off throughout the whole rest of the story. But within this town of Odyssey, or we could say within this Kingdom of God shaped Adventures in Odyssey universe, in this world, it's kind of like everyone's a Christian even if they're not a Christian. The inspector gives the apology not because that's what people normally do in real life, but because kids need to hear what a good apology sounds like and what humility from someone with power can look like. This isn't the way things usually are in the world that grown-ups live in, but rather it's a fictional depiction of key elements of the way the world ought to be. And every one of us, kids and adults alike, learn by example a heck of a lot more than any other way. Next thing I jotted down, respect for parents, elders, and authorities as children. So at the very beginning of the episode, after Whit found the secret room and they're all like, whoa, what is this? And he insists that Jamie, she's the little girl who's the main character. She kind of tags along with Whit and the gang for the whole episode. She kind of represents the listener in a way, like the listeners are all these little kids and Jamie's the little kid who's like, what did you see? That kind of thing. So anyway, so at the very beginning, when they find the secret room, Whit insists that Jamie not come into the room because of the danger, like, stay out. We don't know what's in here yet. And she obeys without any consideration, like it's assumed. Even though this is one of these really highly intense topics. And in my mind, I'm contrasting this instantly with the way the Harry Potter characters acted in Harry Potter books 1 through 3, where the more intense the topic is, the more likely it is that the kids are going to step over what the adults are telling them to do. And then throughout the story, which is a story primarily about adults, but with Jamie being the representative little kid for all the little kid listeners to relate with, throughout the story, she is treated kindly and graciously by the adults, but she's expected to follow appropriate boundaries as a child, for example, bedtime, staying out of danger, etc. And that's all the case, even though she is allowed to take part in a story that in real life wouldn't be appropriate for a kid to have any part in. For example, when she's allowed to accompany Whit to the haunted mansion and stuff like that. So once again, this part here, this is one more element that I doubt anybody in the writing team or the performance team, I doubt anybody had any intentionality of trying to intentionally give this vibe or contain this as a subliminal message. It's an assumption, but it communicates volumes on a subliminal level. This is the implicit, not the explicit messaging. And then I jotted down main message. Greed can destroy. Love of money, etc. There's one particular primary message-focused kind of mini speech that Whit gives near the end of the episode on this topic. And then, of course, we have Chris's cheery postlude that comes after the eerie ending of the episode. I think kids are probably generally a good bit more likely to tune out Chris than to tune out Whit. When I was a kid, I always thought Chris was the boring end matter stuff that you don't really listen to. It's like it's already over. They're preaching now. A little bit of church at the end. That's kind of what it always felt like. But when Whit's talking, on the other hand, that's a little different. That's embedded into the story, and you're not going to miss that part. You're not going to tune out. You just don't realize at that point that you are receiving a form of teaching. And then after that, after identifying the main explicit message being the destructiveness of greed, then after that I jotted down, along with this, the tragedy and hevel nature of sinful pursuits or desires. I said, you can't miss the feeling of sadness and emptiness about how much hurt and harm has been caused by the pull of sinful desire, which Whit speaks of in language similar to hevel. I forget his exact words. And then so when I say hevel in my note there, what I'm talking about is the theme of the book of Ecclesiastes. Basically, painful futility that feels empty and seems to have been offering you things that it never could actually provide. Anyway, so that's a lot of stuff in this episode. The implicit, subliminal, relational attitudes surrounding the benefit of the doubt and suspicion and grace and kindness, respect for the law, as well as a sense of personal responsibility to society and to God, the role of humility and this humble apology, even when you're a powerful person who doesn't want to lose face. And then we got respect for parents and elders and authorities, especially as children. And then we got that main message that greed can destroy, the love of money, as the Bible puts it. Greed can destroy, and then just this tragic, hevel nature of our sinful strivings just in general, how sin offers you one thing and leaves you lonely and sad and alienated and unsatisfied. And this is something that you feel as you come toward the end of the episode. You feel inside you, I don't want to be one of those bad guys striving after something that's going to leave me with nothing or worse than nothing. I want to be like Whit and Connie and little Jamie. I want to be like they are. I want to live in the wonderful, joyful, free, and safe world that they live in under God. Then in my jot notes there, after that part, I couldn't help but keep going into this whole another section here, starting with the header, more mature concepts. Because the thing is, As an adult, there's often stuff that an Odyssey episode implies or suggests, which wouldn't be nearly so impactful to the intended audience of children. But I think a lot of Odyssey episodes have whole layers that are really there just for the adults who may be listening in, or we could say maybe partly just the adults that wrote it, for themselves. So, what I found myself putting down started off with more mature concept number 1, the defilement of place, and I kind of put place in quotes there. So Whit reflects on how uncomfortable it is to have a reminder of the tragic defilement of sin now permanently situated within Whit's End. And I find that interesting because often in real life, a place is psychologically imbued with the things that we know belong there. For example, a church, a graveside, the couch where you watch television. So Whit becomes somber as he recognizes that now Whit's End, which has always been a place that kind of mixes accessible spirituality with fun and safety. And now Whit's End includes death, greed, and human vice. But on the positive side, kind of like a memento mori on a bookshelf, like a skull sitting on a bookshelf to remind you of death. Kind of like a memento mori on a bookshelf, this negative spiritual defilement of place here in Whit's End can serve as a positive reminder. In a sense, it defiles the atmosphere in a proper way because in seeing that stain, we are reminded that all of humanity is so stained. It reminds us that no matter where you are, in this world of people under the sun, the skeletons are everywhere. This is the world in which we live. More mature concept number 2. On what basis do we rightly lean toward trusting or not trusting a stranger? So, in this episode, in regard to the mysterious woman who ended up turning out to be Barfield's sister, but somebody implied during the group discussion, somewhat near the end of the episode, somebody implies the assumption that she's likely telling the truth. And then somebody asks, well, why should we trust her? And then Connie answers back, why should we trust anyone? Now, in this particular situation, we actually do have a number of reasons to lean toward trusting that particular person, which the characters don't particularly bring out. But for a child listener, on the other hand, who doesn't have the capacity or the background to be thinking on that level, the takeaway for the child is going to be that we really sometimes just have to recognize the ambiguity and respond appropriately within the context of ambiguity. And I think that's probably the main subliminal thrust of that whole thread of the story, the whole murder mystery type thread. But on the other hand, for an adult or a mature listener, those scenes give a really intriguing opportunity to be asking oneself on what basis to weigh your trust and distrust of the various characters as the various kinds of evidence accumulate, which adds really just a whole nother level of fun that kids don't have any access to, but it's fun as an adult to be thinking about that as you go through it. More mature concept number 3. Mature viewers who are focused on realism may find themselves unhappy with things like the lack of a sense of danger associated with Whit's early threats received, like the thing on his car that said, leave well enough alone, things like lack of caution throughout the episode in regard to, for example, sharing information with suspects, lack of sensitivity to danger in, for example, talking about the stuff in public so that the mysterious woman can overhear because people are talking about the case in Whit's End and somebody overhears it. So things like that. But I would argue that story features like that are genre appropriate given the intended audience and given the intended feelings and the intended level of impact that the episode is supposed to have, and especially given the genre of lighthearted children's adventure fantasy or adventure drama. I think that these non-realist features, if you want to call them that, I think these kinds of features enable the story to be more relatable and understandable for young listeners by virtue of the simplicity and the mundaneness or the lightheartedness of the story. And to a certain extent, that kind of thing, I think, is required for the goal and the targets of the presentation. And this is also one of the reasons that adults may sometimes enjoy taking a break from normal fiction with its heaviness and seriousness and the high stakes that are involved, and taking a break by enjoying some children's fiction like Adventures in Odyssey, where the stakes always feel lower, even if the story content would, taken more literally, would suggest darkness or fear or danger or such like. So, and Finding secrets within or under a wit's end is always so much fun. This isn't the only episode to do something like that. It seems like every episode that tapped into that theme or a connected one was always such an absolute blast. Those were always some of my favorites, and I think that that sentiment is one that a lot of other Odyssey listeners share. Probably part of why the creators kept on returning to those kinds of stories as the series went on. But while having that fun, while getting swept away into a story that keeps you on the edge of your seat as a kid and then gives you a good pleasant chuckle as an adult, while having all that fun, you're also getting doused in subliminal and not so subliminal messaging, the implicit and the explicit messaging. And you know what? This world needs so many more people in it who, like Whit, value that graciousness and shrewdness that Whit demonstrates, that respectfulness and sense of responsibility, that kindness and judiciousness, that commitment to do what is right under God, the commitment that prizes the tiniest intangible bit of the kingdom of God far beyond any glittering luster of hevel human pursuits like greed or selfish ambition. And then, as Whit reminded us near the end of the episode, it's significant and ever so sobering to have a skeleton under a wit's end, or a skeleton room where the skeleton used to be. And we don't need to board it up or bulldoze the building or try to wipe out the memory with neurotic compulsiveness. We need to keep it and look at it facing straight on. We need to believe that the skeletons are in our world, that our world has sin and fear and so many reasons to grieve for humanity. Because even in cheerful children's fiction, we're not going to find peace and hope by running away from the evidences of suffering and shame and heartache. We find peace and hope by resting face to face with everything that is real, including any secret skeleton room, illuminated by and overshadowed by the warmly glowing eyes of the God who sees and the God who grieves with us.